Hey witches, it's Lee and this is Do the Magical Thing, and I thought we'd have a chat about correspondences. Now these are quite fun things and they're something that you can really put your own mark on, but also you can look at existing law and see if you can sort of mindfully incorporate any of those parts and those elements. Now we're going to look at the definition just to start with to get ourselves really on the same page, and we're going to use Spellcrafting, Aaron Murphy Hiscock's work there, and this is a good book for really digging in and defining and shoring up the spellwork a little bit more perhaps. Now what they say is the system of correspondences is a classification of objects, entities and energies, each of which affect one another or evoke certain outcomes. The system of correspondences arises from a sympathetic association. By using components or ingredients that demonstrate a certain kind of energy, you attract more of the same energy, thus illustrating the like attracts like principle. So I thought that was a good way to start off with it, and really it is demonstrating the idea of it being something that is quite close to sympathetic magic, in that it's something that is like the thing, is the thing. And we use that in things like taglocks. You know, taglock is something that is a representation of a person, and so you may have some of their hair, you may have a picture of them, you may just have their name written out, but that is essentially something that is like the thing, is the thing. And with the idea of correspondences, they are a great way to pile up meaning in your spells. And if you remember from our video on Before You Cast a Spell, we learnt that a spell is an instruction, and that to instruct means to pile up or arrange. And so this really brings us to those kind of core elements of spellwork. Not only this, but correspondences bring us to the 3 C's of witchcraft too. And if you remember those, they were connection, communication and creativity. And correspondences sit quite heavily in the creativity side of things, because we're really thinking about this and playing with it, playing with the ideas of what is similar to what. And not only that, but it is the thing that connects as well. The literal definition of a correspondence is a connection or an equivalency. And so through that, correspondences also connect to connection, and they're how we communicate too. So it covers all those 3 C's of witchcraft, at least is how I see the 3 C's anyway. Now, correspondences obviously are something that join us from the micro to the macro, so the smaller to the larger kind of side of things, and it's quite a kind of in line with the sort of hermetic ideas, and there is this sort of general sense that something that happens on a smaller scale is also represented in a larger sort of format. So for instance, you know, the cells that make up our bodies and the electrons that go around all our little cells and things like that, and our atoms, if you like, they're not only within us, but it kind of reflects in how planets go around suns. And so there's this whole thing going on there that really is about connecting and observing your environment. Now, mundanely, you know, we do this all the time. We do this in terms of, you know, brands, for instance. You think of, you know, a particular brand, and just by looking at their symbol, which represents them, it's something that is like the thing. With that, you look at it and you know whether it's something that you are going to wear, whether it's a brand that you go to eat at, or a brand you're going to drive. And so all these things are kind of inherent. And we do this also with colour magic. A lot of the time we have these inherent and cultural references to colour. There are certain colours that we like more than others. There are certain colours we associate with certain seasons, certain, you know, celebrations, for instance. With things like Yuletide and Christmas, we might think of greens and reds and golds. With things like Valentine's, we often think of reds and pinks and all that kind of stuff. And obviously these will be different depending on where you come from. There will be different things, and that's okay. A lot of books will have great lists, at least witchcraft books will have great lists of correspondences, and that's certainly fine to work from, but it's worth considering, you know, what things do you really think about and what are close to you. And if a correspondence doesn't ring true for you, that's okay. You don't have to use it. It could be something else that really works quite well for you that is slightly different. How you define something is quite key, because you are integral to your witchcraft. You are the thing that creates the thing. So don't worry about all these great big lists of correspondences if you really don't dig what's on there. Now, I do find they're quite helpful to see at least what has come before, and you'll find in Witchcraft that we tend to look at some primary texts for a lot of our sources. So things like the 3 books of occult philosophy and Picatrix and other primary texts that are a little bit more obscure, they can be worth having a look at just to see where these kind of ideas have filtered down from. And what I will say with primary texts, and what I mean by primary texts, is that they are something that has influenced modern craft in a certain way. With primary texts, when you're looking at them, just use a critical eye, because obviously they're from a different time, a different kind of moral mindset, and so there are things that you won't want to incorporate, but things you can at least go, that happened, and this is what I've learned from that. So the 3 books of occult philosophy is one of those ones to perhaps have a look at when you've gone past, a certain amount of other books that are on more practical things. And with it, I've got a copy here. It's something that I find is a bit of a passion project in a way to look at, as I say, once you've got past the sort of beginner books, also once you've kind of done a few workings and you've got your own kind of style, that's great. But I think they can at least inform you. And I think a lot of modern practice often forgets that they kind of claim like quite an older source, or sometimes they claim they've invented this new thing when actually it's already existed in some format. So by reading these primary texts, by reading any kind of history, not just a witch's history, but literal history, so by reading this history, what we're doing is we're arming ourselves with knowledge, and that's a great tool, because what is a witch? A witch is someone who knows things. It's a witch, it's the craft of someone who is knowledgeable. And so that's what we want to do. We want to arm ourselves with all this information, because then not only do we have that more of it for ourselves, and whether we choose to use it or not, whether it's appropriate to use or not, we have to decide, but also we can make sure that people aren't trying to take advantage of other witches in the community or are harming or misinterpreting these things. And so one of the books, as I say, I suppose it's 3 books really, is the 3 books of occult philosophy. Now, this is worth having a little look at, just because of its importance, as I say, in terms of what it has affected now. Does that mean it's a good work? Does that mean it's a work that isn't problematic? Not necessarily. I think that there is certainly a different sense of looking at different cultures from this time. Now, there are certain cultures that are open, certain cultures that are closed. Do your research, listen to people from those cultures. But as I say, worth at least knowing your history. Now, this one is quite a big chunky book. It cost me a bit of a arm and a leg, but it was a birthday money, so I managed to put that towards it. But the reason I invested in it was because it's edited and annotated. And this is quite important because some works are not so accessible, especially for someone like me who doesn't have the best concentration in the world. And so if something's got notes that can really compress the meaning, that's quite helpful. Now, obviously, anyone who is doing the editing will have their own biases, but I think it's worth having at least a go at a proper text and look at reviews and do all that sort of thing. As you can see from within the book, I'll just show you some examples. So this has certain tables of correspondences and certain squares and planetary things, and obviously this has got a lot of information that has been gathered into sort of one place. Again, check the sources, see if it's really appropriate for you to use, and and if not, then I'm sure there's be an equivalent, or you've got your own mind. You can make things that work for you in terms of correspondences and such like. So yeah, just consider primary text as an option. The 3 books of occult philosophy, Picatrix, are the sort of older texts that are associated with correspondences particularly. In modern text, you're probably looking at things like Liber 777. I'm not one to necessarily suggest Crowley's work because he's quite a problematic figure. It's something that I need to look at myself, but that definitely was one of those books that collated these. The Magus beforehand, which is really considered a kind of compression and not necessarily a copy, but definitely inspired a lot by the 3 books of occult philosophy, is another one on correspondences. And then perhaps least or more academic kind of collection of correspondences is the Magicians, or Complete Book of Magicians Tables by Dr. Stephen Skinner, and that one is another large tome that I do want to have a look at, because it has a look at from all different angles, and he's got some interesting thoughts of really correspondences and how they are language, really, and how we've always used them, and that they are, and I think this is the interesting thing that he has to say really from his introduction, is that they are a way of us bringing what's in our internal world into the external world, you know, and this comes back to abracadabra in a way, because that whole idea of as I speak, I create, you know, abracadabra meaning a variant at least of that, then that really is telling us about this speaking into creation. And Dr. Skinner says that really this way of comparing a thing to another thing is just an automatic thing we've done for, well, pretty much all of our human existence. So a few thoughts there for you to have a little ponder on, and just have a little play with. With correspondence, as I say, keep it local, keep it something that's personal to you, and we're going to have a little look at doing that as our next little bit. So we've done the magical theory, let's do the magical thing. Okay, witches, here's our magical thing to do, and it's a simple one this week. I thought we would have a look at the common correspondences and think about our own take on it. So these are some of the ones that we tend to find most, and they're quite accessible to look at too. So with elements, for instance, we can look at the old style kind of classical elements of your earth, air, and your water and fire. And these are sort of some symbols that we see, some glyphs, if you like, that we see for those. And that immediately gives you something to carve onto or write into a spell. With celestial bodies, they also have symbols for them. The sun, for instance, obviously the moon, like so. And you can go on throughout all the different planetary bodies and see what, or celestial bodies, I suppose, and see what they can offer you in terms of correspondences, energy and intent, and adding in their own sort of things. With seasons, we can consider, you know, summer and spring. You know, maybe with spring you might think of a little shoot or something like that. In summer, maybe it's quite a literal sort of sun. Maybe it's a sunflower. Maybe you could do that as your kind of correspondence there. With, you know, autumn, we may think of those sort of autumn leaves coming down from the trees. And in winter, we can think of a traditional sort of snowflake, and that's if that really works for you. Obviously, seasons will vary wherever you are. For days of the week, these are quite often linked with celestial bodies, but I think it's worth considering your own sort of energy levels through the week and seeing where and what you find you do best on each day. Notice any patterns that come up for you. With flora and fauna, what we're really looking at is flora being plants and fauna being animals. What kind of plants really do you really get into? Maybe it's, you know, rosemary is your big favourite. Maybe with your plant or with your animals, maybe you've got a particular one that you really like, and you know, maybe it's a little hedgehog or something thereabouts. And consider what that animal means to you. There may be some sort of common thoughts on it already, but have a little look at your own meanings. That's the sort of key thing here. And with states of being, you know, we could think about what are the correspondences for feeling, you know, happy or elated, excited. What are the correspondences for when you feel, you know, bad or feeling low? What are the correspondences for when you feel, you know, thoughtful and want to be creative? Those sort of different states of being are worth looking into as to what you find you associate with them, so that you can then either combat them or encourage them. With colours, you know, really any kind of colour works for magic, and with them you'll find that you have your own kind of associations. You know, blue, for instance, you might find is a colour that you associate with emotion, maybe red for the kind of more of a fiery, creative sort of things. And we have those sort of colours associated with those different elements as well. So it kind of all comes into one another in this great sort of circle, if you like, of these different things. But really do that bit of thinking to really establish what it is that you feel works to represent these different things. And, you know, words can really be a key starting point. Write out whatever word it is and think, what is the correspondence for this? And use your senses. You know, colour's obviously quite a visual thing. Elements are things you can experience through touch and through sensation. Celestial bodies are more perhaps, again, a visual thing. Seasons, you know, there's things you can taste at different seasons. There's things that you can smell and see. And, you know, days of the week, again, a sort of an experience of time perhaps. With flora and fauna, obviously, again, we're going into sight, smell, touch, that sort of thing. States of being really are more of a spirit kind of thing, I suppose. It's something that you handle psychologically, but you perhaps feel certain things. Maybe certain things you smell or see or feel create certain responses within you. So use those senses, really get yourself an idea of what you're doing there. Now, one of the things we can start with, because it has some quite good roots and it's a pretty open association, is elements. And in the 5th century, there was a Greek chap who mentioned that they thought that really all these 4 classical elements made up everything in the universe, made up all of us really, in different amounts, and these were in differing amounts. Initially it was thought that water was the main thing that made us up. Obviously now we know that really elements are much more complex than this. There are atoms, we're made up of all these other things, but essentially we are made up of the same sort of stuff, that same universal soup, if you like. Now, with these classical elements, they had associations to each season, and this was because spring, for instance, had air because it went from wet to hot. Summer had fire as its representation because it was hot to dry. Earth is autumn for dry to cold, and we head into the winter, which is cold to wet, being water. We think of sort of ice and other things like that. So I thought it might be worth thinking, what kind of things can we do spellwork-wise in these seasons and associated with these elements? Well, really, if you're thinking of something like air, it's very much about communication. And it's also about ideas. So this is a good opportunity for things that are really about creating something new or expressing something. You know, it could be with air as well. Things travel on air, don't they? Sounds and such like. So travel is often associated with air as well. And, you know, really anything that is a kind of joyful, inspirational kind of thing, something that's happening and exciting and quite flexible, really. With summer, we've got fire. Now, fire, we often think of creativity because it's that creative spark. And we also think of protection too. We might think of kind of like sort of more relationship-wise, we might think of lust and passion. That might be another good option for us here. With autumn, with earth, that brings us into sort of a bit more of a kind of, well, literally solid ground. And really we might be thinking of things that are more to do with grounding, maybe more of a kind of, maybe something along the lines of a growth thing too, because, you know, obviously we're looking at the ground, but we're also looking at what comes out of the ground. And so things like growth and abundance are a good thing we could focus on there. We might also focus on our kind of, you know, anything that's to do with where we are grounded most. So maybe you'd want to do something in the home, maybe some home magic or protection or shoring up. And with winter, with water, it's really quite a flowing, emotional kind of aspect there. So we might want to review our psychology, do some shadow work, exploring the sides of us we don't really want to often confront, and perhaps want to look at anything to do with sort of a flow, a real kind of going into those sort of depths. So any sort of, any really kind of a subconscious-y or intuitive. So perhaps you could look at intuition, you could look at developing something like divination. Winter is also a time, you know, when we would come together. So perhaps we would do something to do with our kind of ancestors at this time. You know, it's often a time in family, however that is defined for you, comes together. So you could look at sort of family and how that sort of flows water is essentially what we all originated from in some form or another. So yeah, look at these different seasons. What does spring mean to you? Is spring a good time for you to get out there, to make those sort of initial starts of things? With summer, are you then, from those sprouts there that you've planted, those seeds of magic, are you growing them? Are you maintaining them? Are you creating a little bit more with them? What are the fruits of those? And how are you able to harvest that as we get into the autumn? And in the winter, once we've harvested it, how are we storing and celebrating and going on from that magic? This is obviously quite a long cycle. You can do your sort of month of your lunar cycle and look at this and think about the waxing, the waning, the new and the full moon, and how they would incorporate and what you would associate with them. Maybe you could have an element you could associate to them, and consider what spell work you want to do. This is just a way really of formatting your kind of magical correspondences, putting them into charts. You can make this as lovely or as rough as you like. It could be on the computer, just typing it up into some sort of spreadsheet or something like that if you really want to get more analytical and more sort of technical with it. Or you can literally just scrap it out. You can put it in a planner or whatever it is, but just get creative with it and think about it. Really, what do you associate with it? It's not about anybody else. Obviously, we have these markers, we have these foundational knowledges, but what do you really feel you correspond to? And what do the things that you matter? What matters most to you? How does that correspond magically? So hopefully that gives you some ideas, some food for thought. Those things, again, that are worth looking at are these here. Just consider whether they're something you want to explore a bit further. So, in the meantime, health and wealth.